Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. I came home to the sound of my wife laughing in the kitchen, but there was a second voice with her. A man's. Low, confident, too comfortable in my house at 10:43 at night. When I stepped inside, the laughter stopped so sharply it felt like the air snapped in half. My name is Ethan Cole, 36 years old, avionics engineer. The kind of man who signs off on systems that keep pilots alive. My world is checklists, procedures, tolerances measured in thousands. I don't deal in chaos. I eliminate it. The first thing I noticed wasn't the man himself. It was the smell on my wife's hoodie. Fresh sweat, rubber flooring, chalk. A functional training gym smell I knew wasn't hers. And behind her on the counter sat a Starbucks cup with his name on it, marker still wet, like he'd walked in 10 minutes before I did. She looked at me like a teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. He looked at me the way men look at someone they assume will back down. I didn't say a word. He muttered something about leaving and brushed past me on his way out, carrying his bag like he owned the hallway. I stood there, hands steady, heartbeat even. Years of engineering discipline doesn't disappear because someone insults your marriage on a weeknight. She finally spoke. She said it was a mistake. A stupid moment after closing the club. A kiss that shouldn't have happened. Then, after a long silence, something more. Something she framed as impulsive, meaningless, physical. She said it fast, like ripping gauze off a wound. I didn't shout. I didn't ask questions. I walked to the living room, sat down, and stared at the muted Netflix screensaver drifting across the TV. She kept waiting for me to explode. I didn't. That wasn't going to be my way. In my line of work, when a system fails, you isolate the fault. You don't argue with it. You document it. You adjust course. So I picked up my phone and wrote 3 things in a notes app. Freeze. Track. Respond. She asked if I had anything to say. I told her one word. Understood. Later, when she went to shower, I stepped outside and looked at my Toyota Tacoma parked in the driveway, the only steady thing in a house that suddenly felt foreign. It wasn't anger that hit me. It was clarity. She called it a mistake. And in that moment, I knew I'd make one of my own. I woke up before dawn, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She was curled on her side, facing away from me, like she'd been afraid to turn around and see whether I was watching her. I didn't stay long. I moved quietly, took a shower, dressed, and slipped out while she pretended to sleep. At 6:15, I was in the Walmart parking lot, drinking bad coffee from the machine inside. I needed routine, something I could hold steady while the rest of my life drifted off its axis. The parking lot was empty except for 2 trucks and an older guy loading lumber into his bed. I watched my breath rise in the cold morning air and let the silence settle. My name is Ethan Cole, 36, avionics engineer. I've spent my entire adult life designing systems where failure leads to catastrophe. Failure analysis is second nature to me. You don't fix a crash after impact. You prevent it long before takeoff. When I got home an hour later, she was sitting on the sofa, knees pulled up to her chest, her hair damp from a rushed shower. She said she barely slept. She said she wanted to explain. But the thing about explanations is that they require belief. And belief was the first casualty last night. I didn't argue. I didn't comfort. I didn't accuse. I moved methodically through the house, noting what was mine, what wasn't, what would come with me if I left. Engineers think in terms of contingencies, and everything about my marriage had become a contingency. While she talked, apologies, panic, promises, I opened my laptop and reviewed my schedule for the week. Flight systems diagnostics on Tuesday, a software sync on Thursday, a training session for new hires next week. Everything in my life had structure except the person sitting 6 feet away from me, crying softly into her sleeves. I spent the rest of the morning documenting everything I already knew. Her hours, her shifts, the nights she said she was closing late, the weekends she claimed the gym was understaffed. I didn't create a narrative. I just collected data. Clean, unemotional, chronological. Engineers don't guess. We verify. By noon, she asked if I wanted to go somewhere together. Clear our heads. Maybe get lunch. I told her I needed time to think. That was true. But the kind of thinking I was doing wasn't the kind she had in mind. When I stepped outside to breathe, the Tacoma sat there in the driveway, steady, uncomplicated. I leaned against it and let everything align in my head. Her world of constant motion and noise, my world of precision and silence. She called what happened a mistake. But mistakes happen once. Patterns repeat. And I wasn't interested in stepping back into a pattern I didn't create. I didn't shout. I didn't confront. I simply decided to remove myself from her orbit until I could see the full sky clearly again. The next 48 hours felt like standing under fluorescent lights in an empty hangar. Too bright, too quiet, every sound echoing longer than it should. She kept moving around the house like she was trying to outrun her own shadow. Cleaning counters that were already clean. Folding towels that didn't need folding. Checking her phone, then flipping it face down as if the screen might burn her. She told me she'd blocked him. She told me it meant nothing. She told me she loved me. But each sentence sounded like she was pitching herself a story she hoped I'd co-sign. I didn't challenge anything she said. That was the part that scared her most. Monday morning, I left the house before she woke. I drove the Tacoma out past the industrial strip and parked behind the hangar where I sometimes ate lunch alone. I watched the sun climb over the runway and let the familiar geometry of the place settle me. Straight lines. Predictable paths. Nothing like the world I'd walked into 3 nights ago. At 8 sharp, I went to work, signed in, reviewed the day's diagnostics. My supervisor asked if everything was all right. He said it carefully, the way people talk to a technician holding sensitive equipment. I told him I was fine. My voice sounded steady, almost calm. During lunch, I sat in my car and went through her messages. Not because I didn't trust her. Trust wasn't the active variable anymore, but because I wanted a timeline. Engineers use data to confirm what intuition already knows. Late-night closings that didn't match the gym's posted hours. Staff meetings that didn't appear on the schedule she'd shown me. Photos from work taken at angles meant to hide who was standing 3 feet off frame. None of it was proof on its own. But patterns reveal themselves the way a cracked weld reveals itself under pressure. You don't need to see the break to know exactly where it's forming. That evening, when I walked into the house, she hovered near the kitchen island like she expected a verdict. She asked if we could talk. She said she wanted to fix this. She said she needed me to tell her what I was thinking. I told her I was still processing. She looked at me as if the word itself was a threat. Later, when she left to pick up dinner, I stayed behind and reviewed my flight logs from last year, comparing them to her schedule. Not out of paranoia, out of method. One uncontrolled variable in a system can take down an entire aircraft. Marriages aren't any different. On her way back, she grabbed Starbucks. The logo flashed in her hand as she walked through the door, like a reminder of how easily she moved through busy spaces, bright places, constant interaction. She lived in noise. I lived in structure. And somewhere between those worlds, something had cracked without either of us noticing. She called her choice a mistake. So I began planning mine. Only mine wouldn't be impulsive. It would be precise, clean, quiet. 3 days after the confession, the house felt like a sealed cockpit with failing oxygen. Every conversation was shallow. Every silence carried weight. She hovered near me constantly, as if proximity alone could erase what she'd done. I didn't push her away, but I didn't bridge the distance either. Engineers don't rebuild a damaged system until they've mapped every fracture. That Thursday, I left work early. Told my supervisor I needed to take care of something at home. Instead, I drove to Home Depot and walked the aisles without buying anything. It wasn't the tools I needed. It was the quiet. The background murmur of strangers comparing drill bits and wood stain while my entire life rearranged itself inside my head. Standing between rows of galvanized steel fittings, I realized something simple and final. I hadn't lost control of my life. I had just stopped pretending that things were what they used to be. When I got home, she was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the carpet like she'd been waiting the entire afternoon for the sound of the key turning in the lock. She said she wanted to know where my head was. She said silence was worse than yelling. She said she needed reassurance, something to hold on to. But reassurance is a promise. And I wasn't making promises I hadn't inspected for structural integrity. I told her I was evaluating. She looked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. That night, she asked if we could watch something together. Something normal. Something that felt like us. She queued up a show on Netflix, and we sat on opposite sides of the couch while the opening scene played. I kept my eyes on the screen, but I wasn't watching. I was listening to her breathing, the way it hitched every time she looked at me, the way guilt changes the rhythm of a room. After she went to bed, I stayed up and reviewed the last 6 months of my own behavior. That's the part people forget after an affair. The betrayed partner investigates themselves just as ruthlessly. Or had I been distant? What had I missed? What part of the system had failed under my watch? By midnight, the answer became clear. I hadn't failed. I'd simply trusted someone who operated on impulse while I lived by procedure. She lived in sparks. I lived in schematics. Two incompatible circuits that finally shorted. She called hers a mistake, an accident of impulse and timing. Mine would be different. Not impulsive, not chaotic. A controlled shutdown, a quiet reroute, a clean break from the turbulence she brought into my life. I just hadn't told her yet. By the end of the week, I'd stopped waiting for the house to feel like home again. The tension didn't fade, it calcified. She tried to bridge it with small gestures, making breakfast, brushing my arm when she passed, leaving her phone face up on the counter like evidence she hoped I'd examine and absolve. But I wasn't collecting confessions. I was collecting clarity. Friday morning, I left before sunrise and drove my truck to the far edge of the reservoir, a place I used to go when I needed a clean horizon line. I sat on the tailgate and watched mist roll over the water. No noise, no movement, just space wide enough for the truth to take shape. I realized something as simple as it was final. Repairing a system requires both sides willing to follow a procedure. She wanted forgiveness without the phase where you strip everything down and inspect the wreckage. She wanted the outcome, not the work. On the drive back, she called twice. I didn't answer. I wasn't being petty. I was measuring distance, seeing how silence changed the equation between us. When I finally walked in, she was pacing the kitchen, holding a mug like she needed both hands to steady herself. She said she felt like she was losing me. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she needed to understand how to fix this. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lecture. I told her I needed air and stepped outside. The truth was simpler. I'd already started detaching the moment she said the affair was a mistake. Mistakes don't come with planning, opportunity, and a gym closed after hours. That afternoon, I drove to Walmart for groceries, walking the aisles without a list. I grabbed things I hadn't bought in years, single servings, easy meals, things you choose when you expect to be eating alone. It wasn't a declaration. It was preparation. Back home, she watched me unload the bags with eyes that flicked between fear and hope. She asked if I was leaving. I told her I wasn't going anywhere today. That was the closest thing to comfort I could give her. That night, while she slept curled on the far edge of the bed, I lay awake replaying every signal I'd ignored, every late shift, every moment she'd been physically present but emotionally elsewhere. She called what she did a mistake, but mine would be different. A controlled withdrawal, a quiet exit from the life she took for granted. A shift so subtle she wouldn't realize it was happening until I was already gone. The following week, something inside me shifted from analysis to execution. Not revenge, not punishment, just a quiet reconfiguration of my life without asking for her permission. She noticed the change before I ever said a word. On Monday, I moved my work laptop, manuals, and notebooks out of the shared office and into the garage. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, pretending she was just stopping by, but I could feel her watching every motion, waiting for some clue about what my silence meant. I didn't offer one. Engineers don't narrate repairs while the system is still unstable. Tuesday after work, I stopped at Starbucks and sat in the corner with my phone on silent, reviewing apartment listings instead of heading home immediately. Nothing dramatic, nothing impulsive, just options, square footage, commute distance, rent ranges. Places where the air would be clean again. Places where no one had whispered someone else's name against the kitchen counter at 10:43 p.m. When I got home that night, she tried again. She said she felt like the ground under her feet was disappearing. She said she wanted to fight for us. She begged me to say something, anything, to tell her what direction this was heading. I told her I was thinking. It was the truth, but it wasn't the kind of truth she wanted. Thinking, for me, didn't mean weighing whether to stay. It meant calculating the least destructive exit route. By Wednesday, I'd stopped eating meals with her. I came home later. I left earlier. I kept my phone face down not because I had secrets, but because I had nothing left to explain. She hovered in doorways, always half in shadow, like she hoped catching my eye would anchor me. But eye contact is intimacy, and intimacy is something I no longer had the bandwidth to give. That night, as she watched me rinse a dish in total silence, she asked if I still loved her. Not angrily, not dramatically, just small, fragile, like she already knew the answer. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because answering would give her a marker, a place to stand. And I wasn't giving her footholds in a landscape she'd already fractured. Later, while she cried quietly in the bedroom, I sat at the kitchen table with rental applications open on my laptop. I read each one like a pre-flight checklist, calm and methodical. She had called her affair a mistake. And now, piece by piece, I was becoming my own version of one. A man quietly slipping out of a life she assumed would always wait for her. The shift became obvious the following weekend, when I woke up and realized there was no part of me waiting for her to speak first. No part hoping for repair. I moved through the morning with a steadiness that frightened her more than any argument ever could. She watched me brew coffee like she was watching a man pack a parachute she couldn't see. By noon, I was driving across town to tour an apartment complex I'd found earlier in the week. Clean units, quiet building, 20 minutes from work. A place designed for people who valued order over noise. The leasing agent handed me a set of keys for a self-guided tour, assuming I was just another guy upgrading his living space. She didn't know I was testing the feel of a new life under my feet. I walked each room slowly, noting airflow, natural light, the quiet between the walls. No ghosts of conversations. No echo of her voice. No smell of chalk and sweat from a gym bag I never saw enter the house. Just silence, clean and simple. When I got back home, she was sitting on the sofa with red eyes and a stiffness in her posture that told me she'd been rehearsing something. She said she'd been thinking, too. She said she knew I was pulling away. She said she needed to know if she should fight harder or let me go. I didn't answer. I took off my jacket, hung it up, and walked past her without breaking stride. Not to be cruel. To be clear. Silence is direction when words distort the truth. That evening, she tried to cook dinner, something she rarely did. She kept glancing at me like each movement in the kitchen was a plea for another chance. The food burned. She scraped the pan into the trash and apologized for the smell. I told her it was fine. I meant it. The scent would fade. Other things wouldn't. Later, I stepped outside, sitting on the hood of the car while the sky dimmed into a muted blue. She watched me through the window, not coming out, not calling my name. She was learning. Silence had become the language between us, and she finally understood the weight of it. She had called her affair a mistake. A moment, she said, a lapse, something she never intended. But intention doesn't undo impact. And now I was making a mistake of my own, measured, deliberate, irreversible. One she wouldn't fully recognize until I was already living somewhere else, moving through a life she no longer had access to. The following Tuesday, I made the decision in the quietest way possible. Not with an announcement. Not with an argument. Just action. At lunch, instead of eating with the guys in the hangar, I went back to the apartment complex and submitted an application. The leasing manager asked if I needed a move-in date. I told her I'd know by the end of the week. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't tremble. The choice had already been made long before the paperwork existed. Driving back in the car, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Clarity. Not relief. Not victory. Just a clean line between before and after. When I walked into the house that evening, she was standing near the kitchen island, holding a takeout bag from Target's grocery section like it was some sort of offering. She said she thought we could eat together, talk, try to find our way back. She said she knew she'd broken something, but believed we could rebuild it. Rebuilding is a technical term. It requires integrity in the material. I didn't tell her that. Instead, I moved past her, washed my hands, and ate quietly while she sat across from me, searching my face for any sign of softness. She didn't find any. Not because I was punishing her, but because the part of me capable of comforting her was no longer in the room. Later, she followed me into the bedroom and said she wanted us to go to counseling. She said she'd already called 3 places. She listed them like coordinates on a map she hoped I'd follow. I told her I wasn't ready. She asked when I would be. I didn't answer. Silence again. The only honest language left between us. That night, I lay awake listening to her breathing, sharp and uneven, like someone trying to stay quiet while crying into a pillow. 2 months ago, That sound would have broken me. Now, it only confirmed what I already knew. She was mourning the version of me she expected, not the version standing beside her now. Before dawn, I got up, dressed, and left the house. I didn't know where I was driving until I was already halfway there, back to the apartment, back to that clean, empty space waiting like a runway cleared for departure. She had called her affair a mistake. What I was doing now wasn't a mistake. It was a maneuver, a recalibration. I wasn't leaving her yet, but I had already left the marriage. By the end of that week, the distance between us wasn't emotional anymore. It was physical, tangible, a quiet rearranging of gravity. She kept trying to pull me back into her orbit, but my center of mass had already shifted. I moved through the house like a guest passing through a space I used to own. On Friday, I left work and didn't head home right away. I drove the car out to the overlook near the ridge, a place she never liked because it felt too empty, too exposed. I sat there watching the last light fall behind the hills, thinking about the moment she told me the truth, or whatever version of the truth she thought would hurt least. I remembered how her voice shook, how she tried to shrink the size of what she'd done by calling it impulsive, meaningless, a mistake. But mistakes don't have the weight of someone else's breath on your wife's skin. Mistakes don't leave shadows in someone's eyes when they look at you afterward. When I finally walked inside the house, she was sitting at the table with 2 plates already served. She said she didn't know where I'd been. She said she'd been worried. She said she felt like she was losing her husband inch by inch. I sat down, ate quietly. She watched every bite like it was a verdict. After dinner, she followed me into the living room. She said she wanted to tell me the rest, the details she'd been holding back. She said I deserved full honesty. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't flinch. She talked for nearly 20 minutes while my eyes stayed fixed on a spot on the wall behind her. When she finished, she asked if I hated her. I told her no. Hatred is emotional, and I was past emotion. Later that night, after she fell into an uneasy sleep, I got up and walked through the house with the lights off, letting my eyes adjust. I looked at the spaces we used to fill together. The hallway where we'd laughed, the kitchen where we'd cooked, the living room where she used to fall asleep against me during late-night movies. Everything looked familiar, yet none of it felt like it belonged to us anymore. On the counter sat a small stack of mail she hadn't noticed. At the top was an envelope from the apartment complex. Approved. Move-in date flexible. A handwritten note from the manager. Let us know when you're ready. I folded the letter, slid it into my back pocket, and stood there in the dark kitchen for a long minute. Not sad. Not angry. Just steady. She had called what she did a mistake. My mistake was letting her believe I would always be here. By morning, she would still think she had time. She didn't. I left before sunrise on Saturday. Not to avoid her, but because departures are cleaner in the quiet. She was still asleep, one hand stretched toward the empty side of the bed like muscle memory hadn't caught up to reality. I watched her for a moment, not with longing, but with the detached calm of a man confirming a final system check before powering down. I packed lightly, just enough to fit in the back seat of the car. Clothes, tools, work gear. The rest could stay where it was. Not out of sentiment, out of clarity. Leaving pieces behind makes the exit quieter. By 8, I was at the apartment complex signing the final pages. The manager asked if I needed help moving. I told her I had it handled. Engineers don't outsource their exits. Inside, the new place felt like a clean sheet of metal, unscored, unbent, ready for whatever shape I'd give it. I set my keys on the counter, listened to the echo settle, and realized I hadn't felt this kind of steadiness in months. Around noon, I went to Costco for basics, detergent, paper towels, a few dinners I wouldn't have to think about. Normal, simple things. The kind of things life looks like when the turbulence finally clears. I didn't rush, didn't check my phone, didn't feel the pull of anything waiting back at the old house. When I finally texted her, it was brief. I told her I needed space and wouldn't be home that night. She called twice, then again, then sent a message asking if this was temporary. I didn't answer. Silence isn't cruelty when the truth has already been spoken, it's confirmation. That evening, I sat on the floor of my new living room eating a simple dinner, watching the last light fade through windows that didn't remember us, didn't hold echoes of the night. She fractured everything. My phone buzzed again. She said she didn't want to lose me. She said she'd do anything. She said this didn't have to be the end. But endings don't announce themselves. They arrive in increments, in quiet recalibrations, in a man choosing an empty apartment over a house full of apologies. Around midnight, she sent one last message. She asked if I was punishing her. I set the phone face down and leaned back against the wall. Punishment is emotional. What I was doing wasn't. She had called her affair a mistake, an accident of impulse, timing, weakness. My mistake was different. Methodical, grown from silence and precision. A clean break disguised as a slow drift. A man quietly stepping out of the role she assumed he'd play forever. The truth was simple. She hadn't been replaced. She'd been left behind. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.